Welcome everybody, this is my attempt to do some online learning for you, our very first lesson for week 11. I've got a nice big Google Doc here, it might be helpful if you follow it along on another screen, or you can just watch me ramble through it on this one. So first I'm going to discuss some admin stuff and other bits and pieces that is important for us to know going forward. Second, I'm going to do a little recap of our learning over the last term, nothing too in depth, but just enough to hopefully get your brains warmed up. And third, I'm going to talk about the essay and give you some exercises to undertake that might help you to structure it correctly. Housekeeping. So the first big point is that I'm going to extend your essay due date to the Saturday night of week 11, okay, rather than Thursday. This is so you have a little more time between A, the online publication of these materials, B, our video chat on Wednesday afternoons, more about that soon, and C, the timeline for draft submission. So you can see if you go to the Google Classroom, under the Assessment tab, I've already revised the date. Second, it is worth running through how our weeks will work, at least until we are back at school. Below you'll see our weekly class that we will conduct online. If you ever forget where to go for this class, I've put the Google Meet in the heading of the Google Classroom. So it's on this particular screen cap, so when you go to the classroom and you click on that, it'll take you to our Google Meet. We will have our face-to-face meeting every Wednesday at 3 p.m. sharp. It is important that you are present for this online teaching component. It will provide you an opportunity to ask questions, discuss content, and so forth. I'll give more specific instructions on what we ought to be talking about prior to the actual meet time, but for the moment it is sufficient for you to know that it will generally be about the work I have set you. Therefore, it's important you complete it so as to avoid looking like a goose. And don't worry, for those shrinking violets among you, you will have your camera and audio muted, as I'm sure you have heard in your other classes. It is only I who will look like an awkward Twitch streamer thanking you for subs. Example A. That's at work. The work itself that I set you will generally be in the shape of a Google form with answers you need to complete, similar to how our Flex work has been in the past, or alternately a Google Doc with I knew that would happen. Damn it. With tasks underneath, similar to the ones we once undertook in the Hallison days of a physical classroom. Very often I will ask you to read documents or watch videos. Ideally, I'd love to force you to read a whole book, but alas, one must be realistic. The dearest hope of my heart is that you would be reading broadly for the love of it, but like the dearest hope of many hearts, I know it to be a mere dream. When it comes to navigating your set work in the Google Classroom, I suggest you use the Classwork tab to navigate to the topic Online Learning. This time around, I have made a single entry for each week, and everything you need will be within that tab. I suggest you start with this document and the attached video I will complete and upload, which will contain all the information that you need. Below is an example of what I mean. So it'll be in its own topic called Online Learning. Each week will be clearly labeled along with what we're going to talk about, and so forth. Alright, so we're going to recap some content because I think that is important. So we will do that now. I might do that in a separate video and then we'll return to this. Okay, everybody. I think a timely review of everything we've looked at so far may be useful so that you don't feel the need to run over maybe a dozen or more slideshows and do it piecemeal. So my plan with this particular presentation is not to really address anything new. We're just going to talk about stuff we've looked at in the first 6 weeks of term. And we have had a very disrupted term, so I think it is timely to go back and kind of just do a very brief recap so that the things we've discussed are fresh in your mind, and that may be able to orient you toward beginning term 2 in the right fashion, even though it is going to be difficult having merely or lacking a physical presence in the classroom. So here goes. So we started the term with looking at a bunch of moral dilemmas. You may remember I handed out those sheets and you sat in pairs and you determined how you would or would not respond to individual situations, some of them quite contrived. And there were some issues with ethical dilemmas that we looked at that they are so left field and so unlikely to occur in real life that they kind of make a poor guide for ethical decision making, but they are useful in sort of picking the way we might treat some ideas in normative ethics. And it was also a hook so that you felt that you didn't want to rush and change out of the class immediately. Most likely the proper place we should have started, which we did go to after the dilemmas, was the reason why we should think about ethics at all, why moral philosophy is worth studying, and why indeed it has been studied for 2,500 years in one form or another in the Western civilizational tradition anyway. So you suggested a few reasons. I asked you why should we bother being moral, and you basically boiled things down to, I guess, three categories. And the first one that most of you agreed on is the idea of a social contract. So for those of you who studied political philosophy last year, this will sort of be familiar to you, but it's basically the notion that I give away some of my unlimited freedom as an individual, and in return you give away some of yours. So I give away my freedom to strangle you because you're irritating me, and in turn you give away your right to strangle me because I'm irritating you, etc. So with this kind of social contract, society is able to function. So some kind of ethical standard is required just for the basic fundamentals of running a communal society, one that isn't just isolated individuals, which no society can be. Just as a society, it excludes that idea. So that was one idea we came up with. The other one was, I suppose, a product of sociology and other associated fields that have grown up in the last century or so, but the idea of social norms. So the way you've been raised and trained to think by your parents and by school systems, so forth, create an ethical framework that it becomes sort of second nature to conform to. And the third reason was because of consequences, that if we do behave unethically, we may have, I guess, hard or soft consequences. Hard consequences being, getting grounded when you're a kid for poor behavior to spending a lot of time in prison as an adult. Other soft consequences are things like being, I guess, demonstrably dishonest and then people no longer trusting you. Things that have a consequence that might not be ordained by an authority, but is a consequence anyway of unethical behavior. And then there's sort of the notion of God and I guess karma, if you like, or that idea of a metaphysical accountability, something that kind of governs the way we should behave, and a sense of behaving according to that sort of a system of belief. Nice. One question that came up from this was the idea of what the ethical person is or should be like. So, for example, a person who only does good because they've just sort of been trained to do good, do it without thinking, etc., like an animal responding to stimuli or Pavlov's dog or something similar, is that someone we can really consider moral if they're only responding according to rewards and punishments or incentives? Fortunately for us, I guess the oldest thinkers on the subject, who would be the ancient Greeks, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, etc., certainly believed that a deeper foundation to ethics was indeed present, that it was buried in the logos, which is the ancient Greek word, I suppose, for consciousness or reason, and thereby in our character. And this is mirrored in most organized religions, certainly in the Christian tradition, the notion of free will and so forth, that moral responsibility is something that is deeper than just, I guess, responding to external stimuli. To answer these questions and similar ones, we took a look at the three tiers of ethics as people generally consider them to sit. So metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. There is something of a hierarchy here. Metaethics, as you may remember, is the big picture stuff. Normative ethics is more about how we ought to conduct ourselves according to principles which we might derive from our metaethical positions. And applied ethics is how we might, apply those ethical schools of thought to particular situations. So most often when people talk about ethics, they're usually thinking about things like the ethics of euthanasia or the ethics of capital punishment. Certainly those have been big ethical issues in Western political discussion for the last half century or so. But this is what we're going to do last. So metaethics, you may remember, we'll start with metaethics, deals with the really big picture questions about morality. And it's where we look at complex notions such as moral relativism and the metaphysics of ethics, whether God or similar, or some sense of transcendent authority or accountable, something that everybody's accountable to, etc., is required to make genuine ethical conduct possible. There's problems with just about everything we're going to look at. I'm not going to try and dwell too much on the problems because I will end up ranting for an hour, and I do feel for you all just sitting at your phones or computers having to listen to my voice. So I'll do my best not to get dragged off on tangents. So one question is whether or not moral facts exist. So I suppose what I mean by moral facts, or what the literature means by moral facts, is things that are provably right or wrong regardless of circumstance, that can be objectively demonstrated to be wrong. And you immediately run into trouble with this because it's running up against sort of empirical sciences that can measure things like, velocity and that sort of thing, and that has a certain bunch of scientific criteria around it, whereas morality doesn't seem to. So can we really consider anything to be always morally right or always morally wrong? And this led us to our big kind of conundrum, which was moral relativism. Excuse me, just taking a sip. So if you think about what being relative means, or having a relative position on things, it means that they shift in relation to other things, as opposed to an objectivist view of something where something is sort of set in stone and immobile. So those are kind of, I guess, the two spectrums or extreme ends of the spectrum that we might consider in regard to metaethics. So moral objectivists tend to claim that morals are more or less absolute. Where there are disagreements on moral issues, they're on fringe issues where competing moral facts vie for dominance. So for example, with euthanasia, it will be the moral imperative not to kill people versus the moral imperative to allow people to have the right to end their own lives, I suppose would be the crass way of putting it. But typically, most moral objectivists will agree that there is an absolute moral standard, and that is more or less unchangeable. Relativists, on the other hand, claim that morals are, well, relative. Generally, they fall into two camps. So we're quite familiar with these camps because they are very much a part of, I suppose, the meta-dialogue of contemporary Western society, which is cultural relativism, which is sort of the first category of moral relativism, which comes from a sort of sociological bent and argues that morals and moral facts are culturally constructed or socially constructed. That is, they're man-made, therefore they are variable from time and place, etc. We looked at the example of the Sambia people in New Guinea. Certainly not going to dwell on that in a recorded lecture, but you'll understand that different groups with different moral priorities are a thing. Similarly, individual relativism, or the you do you queen school of thought, is something you may have encountered in your own lives when you've talked to people about perhaps different opinions on a moral action that's happened, and you're loudly shouted at for judging somebody, and they would say, that's just wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me, or something similar. That's demonstrating real lived moral relativism at an individual level. And both these ideas are quite entrenched in, I suppose, the way we tend to think about morals today, as opposed to even a century ago. So we looked at some of the problems here, and it may be worth brushing up on some of the readings on the Google Classroom for memory's sake. Very helpful in getting your head around some of these really complex ideas. There's a lovely image. Two trees viewed differently. We also touched on moral pluralism, but not really in any kind of great detail. But it's an idea that's kind of posited as being the middle ground between moral objectivism and moral relativism, although people have made the claim that it's kind of just moral relativism in a new set of clothes. And it's worth also mentioning here moral nihilists. So they differ from, I suppose, pure relativists. Relativists do believe that right and wrong are categories. They're just categories that are constructed differently at different times. Whereas moral nihilists will typically make the argument that not only is nothing objectively right, but nothing is objectively wrong either. But you typically find these sorts of people are the types who are going to post edgy things on the internet, and generally are usually quite naive about the world. They certainly, when injustice is done to them, they typically have a very strong sense of right and wrong. Anyway, I'm almost on a tangent. I've got to be careful. So are ethics just human products? And that's kind of the core claim of relativism, I suppose. And affiliated with this argument in metaphysics is the notion of where moral certainty, or at least moral authority, comes from. For example, theists, those who believe in God, usually along Christian lines in the West, although increasingly Islamic, etc., are generally moral objectivists because morality, in their eyes, comes from an unchanging, unchangeable source. It is worth making the distinction between sort of theists, or people who broadly believe in God, that's what a theist is, against someone who might profess a more denominational sort of faith, which not only makes a claim about God existing, but also makes claims about what God is like. Relativists, on the other hand, might disagree with this. Typically, although not exclusively, you'll find people who sit on the more relativist end of the spectrum will usually be more agnostic or atheistic in their view of God, whereas people who are more absolutist or objectivist will typically have a more, or at least a more sympathetic to religion or sympathetic to theism sort of worldview. It's a nice picture. Certainly the existence of God changes everything in ethics. Lovely in its empirical unprovability, which means people will probably never stop arguing about this. We spent a bit of time on this too, because the statement made by the Russian novelist Dostoevsky still resonates over a century later. Now, he said, if there is no God or without God, everything is permitted, which was a very sort of pessimistic sort of statement to make on the subject. Friedrich Nietzsche, had a rather more optimistic view on this, that if God is dead, then people can take moral responsibility into their own hands, and therefore it is possible for people to kind of craft a sense of moral authority without kind of recourse to ideas such as God. And these two fellows, real giants of the 19th century, both in literature and in philosophy. So how can you make a meta-ethical system without God? Well, there's been plenty of suggestions. We looked at a few. We didn't have time to really address all of them, but there's quite a few notions that attempt to function without the idea of God. So the ideal observer theory is one of them, that asks us to imagine a perfect ethical figure who we should attempt to emulate. This actually came out of the sciences in an attempt to kind of encourage ethical conduct among experimental scientists. So the ethical observer is ideal, and you should try and emulate him. There's some issues here as well, which is to say, can you believe in something that you fabricated to guide your behavior? It doesn't seem like a terribly binding sort of view on the world. Two other forms that are a bit older: moral rationalism, which is hinted at in Plato. In fact, Plato makes the argument several times lots of times actually, that people who don't do the good, or people who do evil, do it out of ignorance, that they haven't thought enough, that you can achieve morality through rational thought, through reason. And Immanuel Kant in the Enlightenment much later is also big on this idea that pure reason can help us to uncover moral truths about the world. On the other hand, you have ethical intuitivism, which is the idea that morals exist because we sort of instinctively feel that they are there, that we can kind of respond to them without really having to think about them, that we have an inborn moral compass, and therefore that represents something. For example, if people are hungry, that's because food exists. If people are thirsty, that's because there's water. People have moral compasses, therefore moral facts are a thing. So that's one kind of lens of reasoning used to justify those arguments. So meta-ethics is a big field, and we didn't have time to really get into too much of it, but that's a bit of a taste of some of the stuff that we talked about in the first few weeks of the term. Then we moved on to normative ethics. So if you remember, normative ethics is about how we ought to behave, or how we should, I suppose, carve out a moral code or a way of living that reflects the moral ideas that we have probably decided to believe in our meta-ethical conception of the world. Less theoretical, more practical. There are three major schools of thought on this division. I knew I'd tongue-tie myself eventually. Three major schools of thought in this division. So deontology is the first one we looked at, then we looked at consequentialism, and finally we looked at virtue ethics, which was a bit cheeky of me because virtue ethics was sort of the oldest of the three. But anyway, just to remind you what this looks like, here's our little hierarchy again, with normative ethics in the middle. So deontology makes the argument that our moral actions are determined by the quality of the action undertaken, or the value of the action. Therefore, we should not steal, because that is wrong. Adultery is also wrong. These are rules through which we should build our lives. Or duties. You have a duty to your child, for example. You can see where these sorts of duties might collide. For example, if your child is starving, but you also cannot steal, you have a real conflict of moral duties there, which deontology really sort of struggles to answer clearly. And it kind of comes out of these conflicts or moral conundrums, that consequentialism, there's a nice picture of deontology, consequentialism is born. So the idea of consequentialism is that the value of an action is determined by the outcome of the action undertaken. And I gave you the example where Plato asks one of his conversation buddies if he can think of an act that's always right. And this fellow says, repaying your debts is always right. To which Plato says, what happens if you owe a dagger to a man who's homicidally mad? Would it be right to give him back his dagger? To which the conversation partner is forced to concede that no, that would not be morally right. So consequentialism does have some deep roots too. Rules may be broken if the outcome is likely to be good. And we looked at some of the issues with this. That we can't know the future before we act, that's obviously an impossibility. And that you're always sort of taking a risk when you play to consequentialist morality. Utilitarianism, which is a big stream of consequentialism, makes the fundamental claim that the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people is the correct ethical goal. So he's mainly talking about in terms of government and how you, I suppose, govern a society along utilitarian lines. And that was Jeremy Bentham who made this claim. There he is. Problems with utilitarianism as well we looked at in some of our class materials. For instance, if we could increase GDP astronomically by enslaving 20% of the population so the other 80% would live very well, would that therefore be morally justified? And I think you would be hard pushed to find people who would agree to that. Anyway, moving on. So virtue ethics is probably the oldest of the three as a cohesive system. Plato and Aristotle, largely its authors, along with the Stoics who came later. But it's basically the idea that in order to pursue the good life or to find virtue, you need to cultivate it. And that comes through habit, which then forms our character. And this is how you live righteously and morally in the world, rather than kind of trying to take a step back and view individual situations abstractly, which is part of the reason why moral dilemmas often feel so contrived, is because they are being sort of taken out of context and examined in a very strange way. Most of us would kind of, I suppose, resonate with the idea of virtue ethics, at least at one level, when we might make the claim that somebody is a good person or somebody is a bad person. We've typically made a judgment there about their virtue. And I suppose the way the Greeks viewed it is it's something that you need to work on, like it's an artwork or something similar, and you put effort and time into it to cultivate good habits. And the chain of being in this regard is sort of thought, word, deed, habit, character. We talked a little bit about that toward the end, but we probably didn't get into it as much as I would like. But anyway, here are our three big schools of normative ethics: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. Now, it might be that you've forgotten some of this stuff because we did look at it quite early in the term. So if you need a recap from something we haven't looked at before, there's this link. It's attached in the PowerPoint that I'll obviously put in the classroom as well. Now we move on to applied ethics. So this is where most people sort of begin and end their journey into moral philosophy. It's really the shallow end of the pool. It's where we look at specific moral issues that are contemporary in society, and we decide what, I suppose, the correct moral outcome or attitude would be in relation to that thing. So for example, with the Ethics Olympiad that we were thinking about going to before it got canned, one of the questions there was, it's okay to punch Nazis. So that is an applied ethical question. But you'll see that from that applied ethical question, there are bigger normative ethical questions that are drawn out, and then there are meta-ethical questions again that come from that. So applied ethics is big, as I mentioned earlier, in things like abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, and so forth. And they tend to be the fault lines in society where different moral claims compete for, I suppose, supremacy against one another. And they're real points of tension as well, which you probably all have strong views on these things, which we're going to get into later in the term. So that ends our very brief recap, 21 minutes, not that brief. I encourage you wholeheartedly to engage with the material in the Google Classroom if you feel foggy, besides the acceptable level of fogginess. So do remember you are still secondary school students, And usually this sort of philosophy is not taught until you're at university. So be nice to yourselves when it comes to kind of grasping the slippery nature of these ideas. They're not meant to be easy. People have argued about them for a very long time, but they are interesting and they're definitely worth pursuing. So if you aren't sure, you will see all the lessons we did in class. They're still on the classroom. Go and have a look. All the exercises you did attached to them should be in your documents. And this should also have you thinking quite strongly. I mean, I imagine most of you are quite well advanced in your essay now. Although a lot of time has passed, which is why I'm doing this recap, because I know that goldfish have long memories compared to teenagers. So I just want to make sure we're all sort of on the same page, and we're at least heading in the right direction. So we'll get back to the rest of our little thing. Okay, everyone, welcome back from that lovely trip down memory lane. So now we're going to look at what I kind of want you to do prior to Wednesday. Wednesday the 29th. That's going to be our 3 p.m. sharp. Don't be late. That's going to be our voice class, where you're not allowed to be heard or seen. It sounds like most teachers' dream, really, but it's just going to feel very awkward for me. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent. So the exercises we're going to do now is we're going to look at more closely what constitutes a good essay in this subject. A reminder about a few little details that set an essay in philosophy aside from those in other disciplines. So we talked a bit about how you can use first person. After all, it is the contents of your own thoughts I'm interested in. Philosophy is a little bit unique in this, in that writing a good philosophy paper is more than a mere dry academic effort where one writes to a rubric or so forth, but instead I aim, typo, to shape and draw forth your Weltanschauung, or worldview, excuse my terrible German. Studying philosophy properly is a moral and perhaps spiritual, whatever you take that word to mean, exercise. It's getting a bit ranty there. The second big one is that you are dealing with arguments more than evidence for your points. So philosophy is not a science in the empirical sense, but is concerned more often with rationalism, or thinking abstractly, if you like, using the mind to crack open problems and find their logical inconsistencies or problems with premises. We do this all the time in class. When I say to you, what are some of the problems with consequentialism? And you come back with, well, we can't be sure of an outcome in advance. You have just demonstrated the use of your reasoning, or as the Greeks called it, your logos. Nice. So that's the sort of thing you should be doing in your essay, and I promise you, the best way to get good at this is to read the accounts of those who do this well. Plato is a very good example, although many of the documents on the classroom demonstrate this sort of thinking too. And there's plenty of places, plenty of thinkers, and if you want to read some good stuff, just send me an email and I'll give you some ideas. Really, it is the best way to improve your critical thinking. For all the talk of critical thinking and critical analysis in schools, I don't think we do it very well. And that's not so much the fault of contemporary education as much as it is the fault of just the contemporary worldview, I guess, which is it's just not as rationalistic as it has been in the past. Anyway, remember you can spend some of your essay talking about the issue itself and then the remainder on your own arguments or points such as they are. So I'm always happy for you to demonstrate knowledge about an issue as well as the ability to analyze it. And I'm assuming by this stage, and particularly with the extra time we've had, that you've all made an advanced start on this piece of work. If you haven't yet, and you're hoping for an 11th hour miracle effort, then you'd best start reading. I'm also going to assume for the time being that you have researched beyond class notes. Please don't be that kid who just basically repackages my slides and submits that to me. Repetition of essentially things I've said in class almost verbatim is just not the appropriate level of research and reading for a piece of work submitted at college. There are plenty of examples of written material on the Google Classroom that I would hope you've looked through at least as a starting point. They're still there, and there is rich resources a finger click away. If you are getting savvy with the internet, which I imagine most of you are, you should have a sort of inborn filter for what's garbage and what isn't. And going through various online sites and finding good stuff, I mean, it's all there. We've never had access to every published piece of human information the way we do now, and yet we are arguably more poorly read than at any time in history, which says something really interesting about human nature. But I'm going on tangents. I've got to stop. Specifically, I want to look at the construction of a good, strong introduction. which may feel a little like revisiting what we did in class, but is the best place to hinge the rest of your essay. A clear introduction will guide your own thinking and help you from becoming lost in a great mass of words that nobody will believe, to quote Thucydides. Sometimes it comes back at the end of your essay. It pays, rather, to come back at the end of your essay and review your introduction, because occasionally our own arguments develop or derail without our knowing. So it's worth running through your essay when you're done, check your introduction, and make sure that it aligns with what you've actually said and that it aligns with what you've concluded. It's quite embarrassing when a student's introduction does not match their conclusion. Usually it's a product of rushing your work, sort of the first thing you want to avoid doing. Anyway, to recap, so we have our context sentences, which is where you open up your essay, introducing the topic using your own style. This does not suggest your argument necessarily. It can, but doesn't have to, but instead broadly indicates what you will be discussing. Your thesis statement is where you stake your ground and plant your flag. You are taking a position X on this particular contention, which is sometimes called a contention rather than a thesis statement. But for our intents and purposes, they are more or less the same thing. There are some differences, but we won't concern ourselves. And the order of argument is the third part of the introduction. So here you introduce your points as you will discuss them in your subsequent paragraphs in chronological order. 3 is the usual number we deal in, though 2 or 4 are acceptable provided they are strong enough and you have the words to manage them. They are the battalions you will use to prove your thesis statement. Marshal them well. Here is one I prepared earlier, based on a fictional essay question from one of our discussion questions, and my arguments are based on your own ideas that we noted in a very early lesson, and that I just recapped on that PowerPoint. I've pushed it to the next page. Hypothetical essay question. Why should anybody behave in a moral way? Here is my example. Moral philosophy in Western philosophy traces its beginnings to Plato and Socrates, who are credited with creating the ethical turn that began the 2,500-year-long conversation that we now call ethics. Chief among the questions asked by Socrates include the following. Why should anyone behave in a moral way? I suggest we answer this question by considering that we do not live as isolated individuals, that we generally aim to avoid negative consequences for our behavior, and that we ought to be virtuous. First, I'll look at the nature of human interaction and examine why there are concrete goods to behaving morally, even if certain individuals do not necessarily believe in a meta-ethical system. Second, I'll discuss why the avoidance of consequences, such as punishment under the law, serves as a deterrent and encourages at least outward moral behavior. Third, I will analyze the notion of the good life, with inward virtue being its own reward in the context of Plato and Aristotle's notions on the subject. So that's my introduction. I wrote that quite quickly, so please don't be too critical. It's a little wordy, but you know what I am like. I love a good rant, apparently. So this is probably about as big as you want your introduction to be. If your introduction bloats beyond this size, you'll often find that you are saying things that you could easily put into one of your body paragraphs, or you're padding things out. Try to avoid padding things out. It's the most obvious way to reach a word limit. Pad things out in your body paragraphs and make sure that they have some semblance of relation to what you're actually wanting to argue. Now, let's pick it apart into its constituent bits and pieces as specified by the color guide below. Context sentences, thesis statement, order of argument, first, second, and third. Ta-da! It comes out the oven, look at it. Beautifully colored. So our context sentences are these ones. Basically, all I've done is introduce the topic to the audience, so it's very clear to the reader that they're going to be reading about moral philosophy. And more specifically, why should we bother? Then I have stated my own thesis statement here. I suggest we answer this question in this way. So that's basically what I'm going to argue. Then I break it down further into my 3 kind of paragraphs that I will have below, so my order of argument first, second, third. So the first point I'm going to talk about is basically society, man. How there are concrete goods to behaving morally even if certain individuals don't believe in it. Second, I'll talk about why the avoidance of consequences serves as a deterrent and encourages at least outward moral behavior. And then third, I'm going to kind of go off on a big rant about the good life and talking about inward virtue being its own reward. And I'm obviously going to be drawing heavily on virtue ethics to do that. So thus you can see a compact shape emerges from this, and immediately anybody reading understands where I'm heading with my essay. So even if all of this just sounded like gobbledygook to you, hopefully you've seen at least the outline of a structure here. So, I have a task for you. This is probably preaching to the choir at this stage. Nonetheless, I'd very much like it if you could put your own essay draft through a filter of sorts to ensure your introduction reads adequately. So all you need to do is follow this link. It'll take you to this, which will look slightly, well, actually probably look the same because this is the trial version. But all you do is put your name in. So in my case, my name is Evans, so I put Evans in. And then it just asks me to paste my whole introduction, and then it asks me to break it down into these segments. Right? Quite straightforward. So, for example, I would just grab this and whack it in. Then I would whack in my context sentences. Ding. Then I would whack in my thesis statement. Ding. And then I would do the order of argument, which is this bit. Nice. Straightforward. It helps if you've got an introduction. If you don't, anyway, come back. So that's task 1. Once you finish that, come back and we'll talk about the next one. You must make sure you do this by Wednesday, 29th of April, by the way, so I'm going to give you some feedback before it's due. Although the feedback might have to be general to the class. I'm running under the assumption you've all written millions of essays before, but it's never wasted to hear this again. Another task. So below are 3 student introductions from another philosophy class, no one who's presently in the class mind. Using a highlighter tool or similar, so what I'd suggest you do is whack it into another window and then highlight it there. Break each introduction into its composite parts. Please note the subject matter is not something many of you have studied before, so concentrate on the structure, clarity, and writing more so than anything else related to the topic. So here they are, there's 3 of them. Essay Introduction 1. It's all about Plato's allegory of the cave, which is what we study in epistemology, which we'll do next year. If you're in year 12, you did this last year, so it should be quite familiar to you. I'm not going to read them aloud to you. I sort of want you to do this bit on your own. The third one's down here. So what you'll need to do is make sure you have this document open. Fortunately, it's in the same place as this recording. And then you can complete that little exercise with the little highlighters in another tab. Awesome. Love your work. Okay, now we're back after you've done that bit. Did you find that more difficult than you expected? Some of them are a little all over the place, which usually indicates that the essay might be a little all over the place too. Task 3. Nice, you've hopefully done your best. What is that you say? One of them doesn't appear to follow the structure very well? Well done, my Padawans. That was a trick I threw in to trip you up. Well dodged. Now you may need to be judgy, that thing every teenage girl fears. But life is full of judgments. Everywhere we make them and are subject to them from others. So what I want you to do is to kind of rank these 3. Oh, before I go on, in this bit here, I just want you to screenshot the actual colored thing you've done with these 3. So you know what to do. I shouldn't have to tell you. So assuming I've done that already, oh, what a lovely screenshot. Task 3 is where I have to pick which of the 3 essays has the most easily discernible structure, which one is the easiest to understand, and which one has the best attention to spelling, flow, and grammar, and writing skill. So that's a subjective judgment, but we'll see just how subjective it is when everybody's had a crack at it. So you're ranking them for structure, clarity, and writing skill. Well done, everybody. We'll discuss our results on Wednesday. So task 4 is the next one. So you've pretty much worked through a lesson or so of classwork for our opening online lesson. We've done a big, 20 minutes, but without interruptions or rants, so it's not too bad in terms of the little PowerPoint I gave you, the revision one. Hopefully you've gained some insight and at least remembered some key methods in structuring introductions. So the 4th task, which is going to kind of take up the remainder of our weekly time, which is it's that thing, it's that thing every teacher tells people to do when they sit there on their laptops doing anything else, which is working on your draft. You may submit a single body paragraph from your draft to the draft Dropbox anytime before Friday, May 1 at 2200 in line with humanities policies. I'll take a look at them before they're due. So 1 paragraph, gang. I know that's going to hurt, but that's all I can do. That's in line with the equity policy that Gungahlin College has. So do that in the draft box. If you can't remember where that is, it's in the classroom under the assessment tab. That's enough for today, so on Wednesday we'll discuss our thoughts, run through our tasks, and I'll endeavour to answer any questions you may have. Bon voyage, mein Kinder. Evans. There's always one, isn't there?